Warning, the content of these videos contains adult themes which may be distressing. Viewer discretion is advised. Everything you are about to hear is taken from court documents, trial transcripts and various media sources. Hello everyone, and welcome back to True Crime with Mystery Maverick. Today we return to the city of Escondido, California, where we investigate the overlooked suspect and delve into the trials and tribulations that ensued as we try to unravel the mystery, who killed Stephanie Crowe. 12-year-old Stephanie Crowe had been stabbed to death as her family slept, and within days of her murder, the Escondido PD had apprehended 3 suspects. Michael, Stephanie's 14-year-old brother, and his 2 friends, Joshua Treadway and Aaron Hauser, had been arrested and held in juvenile custody for her murder. Convinced of the boys' innocence, and having been informed by Stephanie's parents about a transient roaming the area that night, the boys' attorneys would take a closer look into the alternate suspect. On the night of Stephanie's murder, a man named Richard Tuitt was causing alarm throughout the local area. A number of calls were placed to 911 by concerned citizens regarding Richard's strange and frightening behaviour, including the Crowe's neighbour, Reverend Gary West. Around 7:30 p.m. that night, Danette Mogilensky, living at 25125 Valley Center Road, an area of Ramblewood Ranch, recalls inviting inside an unexpected visitor looking for a girl named Tracy. She said after telling him Tracy was not there, that the man shut the door before reopening it and proceeding to ask for Tracy again before leaving. The first 911 call was placed at 7:50 p.m. by local resident of Valley Center and Lake, Shannon Homer. He had followed Richard in his car after being told by his dad Sheldon that a transient had been prowling their home. Concerned about this, he and his girlfriend followed Tuitt down to the local church. He said they were really worried that the man was acting weird and there were kids hanging around there. The operator asked what car he was in, and Homer replied, he's not driving a car, he's a bum or something, kind of roaming around. My dogs are going nuts. Okay, do you have a clothing description? Replied the operator. Yeah, he's wearing a red sweater and dark pants, replied Homer. Following the call, officers Walters and Osowski were dispatched to the community Lutheran church. At around 8:45 p.m, Officer Osowski cleared the call as gone on arrival and returned to his duties. Just before 9:30 p.m, Patrick and Misty Green were in a trailer on Misty's father's property when a transient, later identified as Tuitt, knocked on the door before entering uninvited, stating, "I want to see your daughter." He was told he had the wrong house, and so he walked up to the main property of Gary West. A few minutes later, police would receive another 911 call, this time from the Crowe's neighbour, Gary West, reporting a transient had knocked on his door and was looking for a girl. West said that the location was remote and up a long road. "He's just got no business up around here," said West to the operator. "It's not like we're just a house on the street. We're up a road in an avocado grove and he's just spooked everyone." Following his call, an officer was dispatched to the area of 3620 East Valley Parkway. According to his report, he got lost on the way, and by the time he arrived he didn't see anyone in the area. He reports that following the road east along the driveway, he came to 24940 Valley Center Road. He reports that as he drove up towards the home, he noticed the lights were on, and the door next to the garage had been closed. He said he didn't see who closed it, and he didn't see anything he thought unusual, so he called it in as gone on arrival. Around 11:45 p.m. that night, Elizabeth Miller was on her way to pick up her friend Cynthia when she saw a transient near Lake Walford and Valley Centre Road. Upon her return, Miss Miller saw the same man standing on the curb looking towards the driveway of the Crowe home. On the morning Stephanie had been found, Sweeney received a call from Shannon Homer's girlfriend Christine Dexter, informing him that a blonde Jesus with long hair was looking for Tracy at the Homer home the previous night. The next day, police made contact with Tuitt, and he voluntarily came to the station, where police collected his clothing: a white t-shirt, a red turtleneck sweatshirt, black jeans and black shoes. Police would ask Richard what he was doing the night of Stephanie's murder. He said he had gone to several houses in the area looking for his friend Tracy. He went on to say he couldn't find Tracy and left the area. Richard told the officers he was not involved in the murder and did not go inside any of the houses he had visited. When officers processed Tuitt at the Escondido Police Department, they found various scrapes and sores on Tuitt's body and a 1.5-inch cut on his right palm before sending him on his way. On the 28th of April 1998, Detective Durgin of the EPD conducted an examination of Tuitt's clothing. Alongside consultant Robert Cheeseman, Durgin would conduct fluorescein testing on Richard's white t-shirt and red sweatshirt and conclude that no blood was present on either. A few days later, the white t-shirt would be sent to the Serological Research Institute for DNA testing. The results showed that only Tuitt's own blood was identified on the shirt, which they believed came from the sores on his body. Meanwhile, the DA would take their evidence to a grand jury, and on the 22nd of May 1998, the boys were indicted for Stephanie's murder. However, before they could even think about a trial, the boys would face a juvenile 707 hearing, where the evidence would be presented and fitness of the boys to be tried as adults would be decided. Whilst Mary Ellen Attridge represented Joshua, Paul Blake would represent Michael, and later author of the book on the case, Donald E. McInnes, would represent Aaron. Over 5 months after Stephanie's murder, and months of anguish and fear in juvenile detention, the 3 boys would face Judge Hams to decide their fate. In what would play out more like a jury trial, the hearing would commence on the 7th of July 1998 and last for over a month. The original prosecutor assigned to the case had been relieved of his duty and replaced by hard-hitting prosecutor Summer Stephan, and the fight was on. Donald E. McInnes described Summer's blind determination and callous insensitivity she showed towards the Crowe family, even calling Cheryl and saying that Michael should just admit to the murder. McInnes states that the problem with her was like with most prosecutors, gathering only the bits and pieces she needed to strengthen her case and ultimately win at any cost. During the hearing, Stephan would call several detectives and investigators to testify. Barry Sweeney and Ralph Claytor would both testify that they found no signs of forced entry. They stated that they believed early on in the investigation that someone in the Crowe home was responsible for Stephanie's murder. However, McInnes, Aaron's attorney, would go on to establish that although there were no signs of forced entry, that the Crowe home was not fully secured, and therefore the possibility of someone entering from outside was not beyond reasoning. Stephan would further question the detectives on the position of Stephanie's body in an attempt to show it was outside of her bedroom door the morning she was found, which meant Michael must have seen Stephanie's body if he'd have walked to the kitchen at 4:30 a.m. Joshua's attorney, Mary Ellen Attridge, certainly no wallflower herself, cross-examined Sweeney on the positioning of Stephanie's body in an attempt to weaken the prosecution's position. She evidenced Judith Kennedy's police statements about finding Stephanie and that Stephanie's door was closed and she had pushed it open before her discovery. She further confronted Sweeney with the knowledge that he had been told by the Crowe parents and paramedics that Stephanie's body had been moved prior to his arrival. Michael's attorney, Paul Blake, would double down on this point by showing that the layout of the house and the alcove in Stephanie's room meant that Stephanie couldn't have been in the hallway and therefore wouldn't have been seen by Michael. All of the boys' defense attorneys would question the detectives on their methods and procedures in order to dispute the credibility of the boys' confessions. Attridge would later question Chris McDonough about the reliability and validity of the CVSA test. Are you aware that the Department of Defense Polygraph Institute has taken the position that the CVSA is in fact an unreliable instrument in the area of truth verification? No. Are you aware that the American Association of Police Polygraphists has taken the position that the computer stress analyzer jeopardizes criminal proceedings? No, I haven't seen that, replied McDonough. The defense lawyers then zeroed in on the fact that McDonough had breached his own procedural boundaries by gathering prior information from detectives and forming a preconceived notion of guilt. During the hearing, the defense sought to offer Richard Tuitt as a perpetrator of Stephanie's murder and asked the officers a number of questions regarding their knowledge of Tuitt and their failings to apprehend him as a suspect. Claytor testified he knew of Richard Tuitt and that he was known within the police department for his mental instability. He was aware that Tuitt had been in the neighbourhood looking for a girl named Tracy, who he identified as being known to have a previous drug addiction. Attridge established that Tuitt's interview was fairly quick and paled in comparison to the intensity of the interrogation of the boys. Is it fair to say that Detective McDonough and the stress analysis machine were never called to be utilised in an interview of Mr. Tuitt? She asked sarcastically. That's correct, replied Claytor. In fact, Detective Sweeney let Mr. Tuitt go on his way. That's correct. Claytor would say he did not think that Richard Tuitt was capable of going into the Crowe home and committing this type of crime unnoticed. He believed that the crime was organised and that Tuitt was, quote, a bumbling prowler. Tracy Chaffin would also testify, the very Tracy Tuitt was looking for on the night of the crime. Tracy testified that she had known Richard for around 4 years after meeting him in the 1990s through mutual friends. She said she had lived a wild lifestyle of drug-fueled partying at the time, and her and Tuitt would use and party together. Tracy explained she had once lived off Valley Centre Road with her son for a few years, and Tuitt would come looking for her. In 1996, Tracy would receive a surprise visit from Tuitt, who entered her home but was then told by her husband to leave. She said that methamphetamine was their drug of choice and that they would often use for 4 or 5 days at a time. She said that Richard had never been violent with her, however, he did get, quote, weird and paranoid to the point where he thought he was being followed and she would have to calm him down. Throughout the hearing, the prosecutor would assassinate the boys' characters. She asserted that other weapons were found in the boys' homes, and she implied that documents on DNA found in Aaron's locker and his love of medieval novels with titles such as Wizard's First Rule and Stone of Tears were evidence of a dark character. Determined to paint a picture of Aaron as the cold-hearted mastermind of this plan, she called Detective Lanigan to the stand. He testified that Aaron was calm and calculated, and that there was an intelligence in Aaron beyond his years. In a later 48 Hours interview, Summer Stephan said, "The motive started out as this hate, but then it turned out as some sort of game. of "let's plan this out, let's see if we can pull this off." McInnes would go on to defend Aaron against these accusations. He asked Detective Sweeney if he had checked Aaron's school curriculum to see if Aaron had been studying DNA at school, to which the detective replied he had not. In an attempt to show that Michael was disconnected from his family and had far from stable home life, Portia Nowak would take the stand and testify that there were a lot of dirty dishes in Michael's room, and that she had found a common theme of the O.J. Simpson trial to the magazines collected from Michael Crowe's room. On the contrary, one Escondido police officer, Johnny Martin, would testify that he had arrived at the Crowe home around 10 minutes after the call to 911. He had stated in his report that the family were visibly upset and that Michael was crying too. The prosecution would further call a handwriting expert, William Lever, to the stand in an effort to confirm that Michael's handwriting was a match to the words "kill, kill." The expert said he examined the words "kill, kill" written on the windowsill with samples of Michael's handwriting and implied it was a conclusive match. However, Attridge, who was well versed in applications of forensics, challenged Lever on his conclusions. "Michael could be the author, but he might not be, right?" "He could be the author, yes," replied Lever. "And he might not be," pushed the attorney. "There's a possibility he might not be," replied Lever. Stefan would call a number of probation officers to the stand. Joseph Carrasco would testify about his conversation with Michael after his arrest. He stated that he told Michael that the police believed he had killed his sister, in which Michael had responded, quote, "There's a chance I didn't do this, but it is possible I did, I guess. I'm almost sure I didn't do it, almost 100% sure." Paul Blake would cross-examine him regarding Michael's state of mind at the time of the interview, and whether or not he was aware that Michael was still under the influence of police coercion. In an attempt to show probable cause, Stefan called medical examiner Brian Blackburn to the stand. He testified that he believed Stephanie was lying down on her bed, at least when some of the wounds had been inflicted. Blackburn went on to testify regarding his examination of the best defense knife. He found it to be consistent with the longest wounds on Stephanie, but he couldn't rule out that another knife had been used, or even two. Under cross-examination by McInnes, Dr. Blackburn would state that it would take considerable force to cut through bone, and that anyone of a normal muscle mass around 130 pounds could do it. Attridge would end the cross-examination with Blackburn, clarifying that due to the remnants of food found in Stephanie's stomach and rigor mortis present, that it narrowed the time of her death to between 9:30 p.m. and 12:30 p.m. the evening before. She would ask about the knife and how common it was to the population. "There are literally thousands of knives in San Diego that could have inflicted those wounds, is that correct?" "There are many, I presume, yes," replied Blackburn. In a further attempt to show probable cause, the prosecutor called another of the boys' school friends to the stand. During the search of the Treadway home, police had also found a small compass knife, which they later established Joshua had stolen from Scott Colgrove. On cross-examination, Attridge countered the argument by showing that Scott was a close friend to the other boys, and that he had never heard of any plan to kill anyone, let alone Stephanie. McInnes then established with Scott that rather than a dark, introverted genius, Aaron was popular with his band members and sociable. Various family members of the boys would testify in their defense. Joshua's father would testify that he had tried to go into the interview room with his son, but was advised by Claytor that parents were not allowed to be present. He said that upon detectives informing him that Joshua needed to take the CVSA test, he stated he was not comfortable with the idea and that he needed an attorney. Again, Detective Claytor dissuaded him from acquiring an attorney and told him to sign the release forms. He recalls the detective saying, "Listen, the DA is here with a murder one arrest warrant for Josh. We've got the murder weapon. His fingerprints are on it. He's going down for the murder of Stephanie Crowe. I don't believe he did it, but that's what we're going to do if he doesn't take the lie detector test." He remembered going to bed around 11:30 p.m. and telling Joshua that his brother Zach to quiet him down as Josh had finals the next morning. He said he woke around 12:10 p.m. as he could still hear the boys chattering but had fallen back to sleep. He further stated he would have heard Joshua leave as it is easy to hear as he slept a few feet away from the front door, and the door to his son's room made, quote, "a lot of noise when opened." Aaron's brother also took the stand. He said he shared a bedroom with Aaron and he remembered that night because Aaron had finals the next morning too. He described seeing Aaron the next morning and recalls that he had also aced his exams. He further said there is no way that Aaron could have left the house without him noticing. To counter this, Detective Claytor claimed himself and Detective Han had walked from Joshua's house to Aaron's house and then to Michael's to show that 1 hour and 20-minute walk was indeed possible for the boys. In what would turn out to be very uneventful testimony, George Durgin of the Escondido Crime Lab would testify regarding the crime lab and DNA tests that were carried out, the results of which regrettably amounted to a complete absence of physical evidence in the case. Judgment Day, August the 11th, 1998. The book She's So Cold describes the intense feeling that day as people piled into the courtroom for Judgment Day. After a short rebuttal by the prosecutor, the judge would dismiss the court for 5 minutes before she delivered her decision. On her return, the judge announced, "I'm going to cut to the chase. You have all waited long enough. I find that the people have established a sufficient case against the 3 accused. I will release these minors on their own recognizance, pending trial as juveniles in the Superior Court. But I have a strong suspicion that their involvement in the crime is nowhere near beyond reasonable doubt. If there were a trial, these boys would not be guilty." That day, the boys would leave the courthouse with their families and attorneys in celebration for the small victory and return home for the first time in over 6 months. Despite the judge's warnings, the prosecutors ploughed forward with the case against the boys. They would start with Joshua in an effort to get a conviction, then offering him a plea deal to give up his friends. The defense wasn't given up that easily either. A month before Joshua's trial, Judge Thompson would throw out the majority of the confessions on the basis that they were coerced. Police had failed to Mirandize Joshua before his second interview, so that part of the confession was also thrown out too. However, the judge did allow Joshua's second confession from his third interview, which contained the majority of the incriminating statements. Although he did conclude that Joshua's confession could not be used against Michael or Aaron. Joshua would be the first to stand trial, and several pre-hearings were held as it was set in motion. It was at one of those hearings that Aaron's attorney had approached Attridge and persuaded her to test Tuitt's clothing again for DNA. This was a risky strategy, as if it came back negative, it could all but eliminate their alternate suspect. Attridge would go on to observe the clothing from the police evidence locker, the clothing Richard was wearing the night of Stephanie's murder and the following day. She noticed there was considerable staining on the red sweatshirt and found out it hadn't been sent for DNA testing. She would later say in a 48 Hours interview, "When we went to see the evidence, I looked at Richard Jewett's clothing and I thought this stuff is a cesspool of biological material. When taking a closer look at the red sweatshirt, she saw what could possibly be blood stains." At the following hearing, Attridge and the prosecutor would approach the judge and demand that all of Jewett's clothing be sent for DNA testing. On the first day of jury selection in Joshua Treadway's trial, the boys' defense attorneys would receive a phone call from Dr. Blake at the Forensic Science Association saying they had identified 3 stains of blood on the sweatshirt and were able to obtain a full genetic profile from a sample taken from Jewett's right sleeve. The results were at an estimate frequency of 1 in 500 billion to be the blood of Stephanie Crowe. The results sent shockwaves through the courtroom and the prosecution were dumbfounded. The judge put a hold on the trial and 6 weeks later charges against the boys were dropped on the basis they could be tried again in the future following further investigation of the evidence. It would be almost a year later, on October the 14th, 1999, that the District Attorney's Office would send Jewett's clothing for their own testing. This time, Cellmark Diagnostics DNA Laboratory would confirm a full genetic profile of Stephanie Crowe on the sleeve of Jewett's sweatshirt. They further sampled 6 small stains on the sweatshirt in close proximity. They found there were a mixture of at least 2 individuals, the major contributor being Stephanie Crowe and the minor contributor being Richard Jewett himself. With the DA's office unwilling to drop the case against the boys and too many unanswered questions, the state's Attorney General's office would take over the Crowe case. Vic Caloca, a senior detective with the San Diego Sheriff's Office, would head up the new investigation. In a later arrest report, Caloca said that it wasn't until March of 2000 that they would start receiving evidence from the Escondido Police Department. Caloca would take a fresh look at the investigation in his determination to get justice for Stephanie Crowe. On April the 13th, 2000, Caloca would interview Jewett about the night of Stephanie's murder. Jewett would admit that he had entered the Crowe home that night, but would deny having anything to do with the murder. On July the 13th, 2000, criminalists for the San Bernardino Sheriff's Department, Deputy Craig Ogino and Deputy Merritt, would conduct blood spatter analysis on Jewett's red sweatshirt. They examined the bloodstains that had previously been identified through DNA testing. Under microscopic examination, the bloodstains revealed that the stains extended down into the fibers of the shirt. They concluded that the size and the nature of the stains were consistent with airborne blood spatter rather than transfer. Caloca was further able to disprove the state's theory that Stephanie's body had been moved from the bed following her murder. Caloca further reviewed all the video and transcripts of the boys' interviews. He noted in his arrest warrant that the boys' arrest and subsequent charges were principally based on the incriminating statements made by Joshua Treadway. He further goes on to say that he believed that Joshua's statements were coerced and false. He believed that there was probable cause to issue a felony arrest warrant for Richard Raymond Jewett. Caloca would submit his report to Judge Frederick Link at the Superior Court of California on the 13th of May 2002. Jewett was serving time at the Donovan State Prison for a parole violation of a burglary conviction. But on the 14th of May 2002, the Attorney General's Office would issue a felony arrest warrant on Jewett for the murder of Stephanie Crowe. In an interview in the Escondido Tribune ahead of Tuitt's trial, Cheryl expressed the family's hope that justice for Stephanie and for their sons would finally be done. She said they worried that Stephanie's memory had been forgotten in the midst of all the tribulations. Shannon Crowe said, "She's not just a murdered girl, she was a real person." However, just as jury selection began in his murder trial, Tuitt absconded from police custody of the courthouse. He was later apprehended in a nearby town and would finally stand trial for the murder of Stephanie Crowe. In what Tuitt's defense attorney Brad Patton would describe as a trial within a trial, the boys would essentially be on trial once again. The boys' confessions would be allowed into evidence this time, and the boys, now young men, would all testify in their own defense. One of the prosecutors, Dave Drewliner, would start by telling the jury, "The evidence that we are going to present to show you that Mr. Tuitt, this gentleman, has a weapon of choice, and his weapon of choice is a knife." They went on to present a police report that a few months before Stephanie's murder, Tuitt had stabbed another transient with a knife, injuring him in the back and head. In the end, no charges were brought regarding this crime, but prosecutors thought it showed modus operandi. The prosecution, Dave Drewliner and Jim Dutton, presented evidence that Tuitt had a lengthy criminal record, which included burglary and harassing a minor. They called witnesses to testify on the sightings of Tuitt that night and his proximity to the Crowe home. Lastly, they pointed to the DNA evidence on both Tuitt's white t-shirt and red sweatshirt, indicating that he was indeed the perpetrator of the crime. One of Tuitt's defense team, William Fletcher, claimed that the blood got on Tuitt's shirt due to police contamination. They claimed that officers who picked Tuitt up the day after Stephanie's murder had transferred the blood using a crime scene camera tripod. Their theory was that Stephanie's blood was dried onto the tripod during the crime scene examination, and that when officers used the tripod to take photos of Tuitt's clothing, they had transferred the blood. They contended that when the clothing was subsequently sent to the crime lab for testing using wet chemicals, that dry blood turned into a wet blood stain. However, expert witnesses would testify as to the nature of the bloodstains and opine that the most likely means of Stephanie's blood ending up on Tuitt's shirt was from blood that was wet at the time of contact. Officers who also testified that they tried hard not to get Stephanie's blood on them at the crime scene, and to their knowledge they hadn't tracked any into the holding cell at all. Patton would claim there was no motive for Tuitt to kill Stephanie. He pointed to the boy's own words and said that Michael had the hate of his sister and that Joshua had detailed how the crime occurred. After a 3-month-long trial and 6 long years since Stephanie's murder, the jury would file out for deliberations in the trial of Richard Tuitt. Unable to establish premeditation on the part of Tuitt, the jury decided to convict him on the lesser charge of voluntary manslaughter. Outside the courtroom, Cheryl Crowe would make a statement to the news reporters. "I just want to thank the prosecutors. They did a wonderful job. They took a lot of time to do what was almost impossible, but they did it, got justice for Stephanie." In a news conference outside the courthouse, the prosecutor would affirm the jury's verdict and add that finally the truth had been told and the cloud of suspicion would finally be lifted from the boys. In a 48 hours interview, Tuitt's mother said she was in absolute disbelief at the verdict. 3 months later, the judge, whilst acknowledging Tuitt's mental instability, would sentence Tuitt to the maximum term of 13 years in state prison and 4 more years for his escape attempt at the start of his trial. In another shocking turn of events, Tuitt's attorneys would win him a retrial on appeal and the ordeal for the families would begin again. This time, evidence of Tuitt's previous knife attack would be excluded. The jury would have doubts about the evidence against Tuitt and the fact that there was no evidence of Tuitt found inside the Crowe home. On the 5th of December 2013, the jury would return a verdict of not guilty, which meant Tuitt could not be tried again for Stephanie's murder. Cheryl Crowe would say after the verdict, "They let a killer go free. There's no justice in this world for Stephanie. There just isn't. We've already accepted that." The boys and their families would go on to sue the Escondido and Oceanside police departments, and in 2007 they would win multi-million-dollar settlements in the civil suits. Silverman, who represented the Crowes in the suit, would essentially conduct a third investigation into Stephanie's murder. During this investigation, a number of experts and private investigators would uncover some new facts on the case. World-renowned forensic pathologist Cyril Wecht would produce a report for Silverman. He stated he believed that Stephanie's death was no later than 11 p.m. and she had died inside her doorway. He said that based on previous findings showing a unique hilt pattern, that the best defense knife was unlikely to be the murder weapon used to kill Stephanie. Another report submitted by private investigator Larry Bird and Associates outlined various pieces of evidence that indicated an intruder was responsible for the crime. He said that numerous red fibres were found on Stephanie's bed and suggests that there is no record of the fibres being tested or compared to items in the house. He points to the fact that several twigs were found next to the body and inside the Crowe home. He further points to the fact that Stephanie's bedroom drawer had been pulled out and turned over on the floor. He would further go on to say that when Tuitt had been picked up initially, several random items belonging to the Crowes were found in his pocket. Later in 2012, a Superior Court judge made a ruling that Michael, Aaron and Joshua were factually innocent and declared that no further criminal proceedings would be brought against them for the murder of Stephanie Crowe. The Crowe family would move out of the area of Escondido and Michael would get married. The family tried to move on from the pain of their ordeal in the criminal justice system. They remember Stephanie as the bright, beautiful, active and helpful girl that she was. On the final episode, I will critically evaluate the evidence collection and forensic procedures utilised in the case. I will outline the offender risk factors in relation to both the boys and Richard Tuitt and the probabilities relating to their involvement in the crime. I will summarise my research findings and share questions that arose, mistakes I believe that were made, and ultimately lessons to be learnt. As we come to the conclusion in the mystery, Who Killed Stephanie Crowe?